Good morning, neighbors. So today's topic is something that I saw being discussed in a chat right as I went to bed last night, and kind of thought about it all night while I was sleeping and thought about it when I woke up. It is, someone made the statement that voting is sometimes self-defense, and I disagree with that statement, and so I figured I would take some time to explain why. Now, I'm not on my GoPro today, so the audio is from my Dashcam, so if the Dashcam detects that I'm deviating in a lane, or someone cuts in front of me, or I merge in behind someone and it thinks it might be a little too close, it's gonna pop a little warning, and that could be a little loud if you're wearing headphones, so please be aware of that. So the question about whether or not voting can be self-defense, it kind of it hinges on the definition of two terms. One is voting, and the other is self-defense. And the interesting thing about such an absolute statement, voting can be self-defense, well, we've got the popo off here to my side, unit 185. Nope. So, whether or not voting can be self-defense, that's an interesting discussion, because if you go and you dig into the definitions of the two key terms, I mean, vote, is mathematically you can replace it with the equal sign. So, and yeah, the person said, they essentially indicated that it can sometimes be self-defense, but so it's not a true equal, but let's narrow the whole discussion down to the times when it is, and then simplify it with voting is self-defense. Realizing that there are some cases that are outside of that could also be true. So the interesting thing is that voting, even though a lot of people do it, the actual legal process of voting, and what it is, as far as a tangible thing, are not well understood by the average person, especially the average voter. And we oftentimes first encounter voting. I saw it explained in a children's show. People were just explaining there were some very positive choices, like which kind of ice cream do you want, chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, and the thing is, in the kind of voting that we encounter in our everyday lives, such as what flavor of ice cream we want, or children want, is that there's always another option. Children would not think voting was on ice cream was a good thing if they didn't like ice cream at all, and whichever type of ice cream was selected for them by the group, they would have 5 gallons of it force-fed down their throat while they kicked and screamed and cried. That's how voting is in reality in the political system. Because when you vote for ice cream, there's always the vote to not participate and to just, not have ice cream or not eat ice cream. And that is a totally legitimate choice to have. In an effort to provide some of that, the Libertarian Party and all of their internal voting, they have an option of none of the above, nota. And this is for everything, including the chairman of the party, who is the party's top spokesperson and such. There's always the option to have none of the choices provided to you, and I think that contributes to the legitimacy of it, because in the case of the Libertarian Party, all of its members are there voluntarily. The party does not force anyone to be a member, and So if you don't like the directors that everyone else votes for, you really can leave and be completely unaffected by their choices. And then on top of that, you also have the choice as a member to try to get everyone to not have any leader at all or any other position in the party. So, that's a difference between voting as most people experience and political voting, which there's none of the above option. The other thing that is not well understood, so that's one component, voting. And then the other component to the statement is self-defense, which if you look at all of the Black Lives Matter protests and all of these things, you have all these cases where law enforcement has shot unarmed people, and people flip out because they think that as long as you don't have a gun, no one should be allowed to shoot you. And the reality of self-defense laws and self-defense, as a practical philosophical concept, is that there are people who can pose a threat to you that is lethal, and that a lethal response of any kind is warranted. Any kind available to you is warranted in those circumstances. So when you hear about all these court cases, going through the system and everything, and what I would have as a test, whether or not it's a legitimate, self-defense shooting, is whether or not, I would remove the fact that the person is a police officer or a agent of the state from the case. I would just scrub that and say, if it were me, a lay person, a common man, if I were in the same situation, would an everyman have been legitimate in using lethal force in that case? And that's how I think we could get toward better justice in this kind of shooting. But the law enforcement community is totally against that. They don't want equal rights, they want special rights and special treatment. And part of that is that law enforcement are agents of the state, and so they are doing things. The reason that they need special protection is because they're doing things that I can't do. And if I did those things, they would be criminal. And if I did those things and then claimed self-defense, my self-defense, defense would not stand. So that's why police want to maintain their special privileges, and that's why police unions fight so hard to defend even rather horrific cases of police abuse. They have to raise to a pretty high standard of depravity before a police union is going to step away and say, hey buddy, you're on your own here. So yeah, we have those two cases of people not understanding voting and people not understanding self-defense. Self-defense is a very complex topic because it has a different standard in just about every state. So if you're talking about it in the legal sense, you really have to know case law. It's not just enough to go and read the statute on it. You have to know case law and precedents and all these kinds of things. And you have to know things that, if you're considering the state law, you also have to consider federal precedents and Supreme Court precedents and all this stuff. So it's very difficult to know what self-defense is. And as a self-defense instructor for over 10 years, my best advice to people is to avoid all situations where you may, feel the need to act in self-defense, because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that goes many times so when you've critically wounded someone or even killed someone. Even if you're vindicated, most of the people that I've talked to who have gone through that, they have never been the same afterward. And even if they are vindicated in criminal court, there's still a lifetime of other civil proceedings and stuff that can damage and destroy their lives. So it's a situation best avoided. Let's see. So, yeah, raises kind of the question, so is voting ever self-defense? Well, one of the problems with voting, in addition to the fact that you can't opt out of it, you don't have a none of the above option, is that you also don't have a situation where you can limit the effect of the response. So in self-defense laws, people look at whether or not your response was proportional to the threat. So if someone is throwing rocks at you and you pull out a bazooka and blow them up and damage nearby buildings and stuff like that, they're going to look at whether or not that was really your only option, whether or not you might have been able to retreat or get maybe something other than rocks, maybe a chemical spray or something like that. I mean, there are all kinds of options that people are going to look at, whether or not they were readily available to you, and also whether or not you started the altercation that you feel required self-defense. So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit too is this idea of, I've seen people arguing about whether or not voting is moral in the past couple days. It seems to be a hot topic in some of the chats and among some of my friends online and stuff. They're very fascinated with this subject, but when I read the discussions, there's a tendency to be arguing up in the leaves, in the canopy of the tree, so to speak, and they don't really seem to stay focused on the trunk. And if they settle the ethical questions at the trunk level, that would provide some guidance for whether or not the leaves of the canopy can stand on their own. So one of the ideas I was talking to another friend about is the idea of a minimum viable argument. There's an idea of minimum viable product or minimum viable solution in programming, where essentially you write code that is designed to be the least amount of code possible to satisfy the requirements. And this is also a concept in self-defense. You want the least amount of force required to satisfy the requirement of removing the victim from peril. Okay, so that's what you're looking for as a solution, and that's what you're looking for when you're proving a case like this. Like, is self-defense, is voting self-defense, or is voting even legitimate? You want to really focus on the least amount of argument that will prove all of the key elements of it. So I don't really have, I haven't spent a ton of time formulating this. I think to properly be done, someone needs to go in and really dig through the possible definitions of voting, also how voting actually works, where the people involved are, also self-defense, how that typically works from an ethical standpoint. And then once everyone understands and agrees upon what voting and self-defense mean, the actual question will tend to answer itself, because it should be pretty obvious once those are sufficiently defined, whether or not one constitutes the other. So I would say that here are a couple of the things, without doing that, here are a couple of things that bother me about that statement and lead me to believe that voting cannot be self-defense. One is that voting can hurt innocent bystanders. It can hurt people that didn't vote at all. And so that would not be self-defense any more than, gassing an entire movie theater to death would stop just a single person shooting at you or something. That actually happened in Russia, in Beslan, Russia. They had some terrorists holed up in in a school, in the school theater, and so they used gas that was potentially lethal, and I think it may have ended up, I don't remember if it did kill any people, but it definitely had the potential to kill some people, and they used it to stop some terrorists because the terrorists were rigged up to bombs. And so in that case, it may have actually been a legitimate solution because there was the risk of explosions if they used a shorter method, or if they stormed it with a SWAT team or something like that. So, a lot of these things depend on the situation. And, that's one of the things about voting is that, so even if you vote for a person in self-defense, the person that you voted for could cause harm to others. So it doesn't really meet the standard of self-defense, because you're going way beyond what is necessary potentially to protect yourself from the potential actions of that the individual. And one thing that I would point out is that it's kind of ridiculous. The example was Hillary versus Trump, and someone said they voted for Trump in self-defense. Well, I mean, there are things that Trump will do as the head of state, as the top statist, that will invariably hurt people. And this is not a situation that can be avoided. And it's also unclear that, you start kind of getting into a hedonism kind of argument. You start getting into some fallacies where you think you knew what was going to happen. I mean, I was not a fan of Hillary, but I also don't know who would have been most harmful overall. I believe Hillary would have, but I don't know. And so I can't really vote for Trump on self-defense grounds. There are other reasons that a person might do that, but self-defense, I don't believe, can be a legitimate response. Let's see what. Oh, yeah. So I talked a little bit about minimum viable arguments of voting. Oh, yeah. So one of the things with voting is that, unlike things like ice cream and stuff, your choices are tremendously controlled. I mean, you see it a lot in presidential races. It starts out from a wide field of candidates and then gets narrowed down to just a handful. But, one of the things that people don't understand is that on the downside of it, there are so many people that are weeded out just by the process that never even are able to become a certified candidate. People that have to settle for being a write-in, and it's possible that those would actually have been a candidate that may have had an element of self-defense. Maybe their whole platform was that they were going to dismantle the state, and so they were going to use the position of federal power to essentially on day one dismantle the state and put in place some set of checks or intended to prevent the state from becoming a threat again. I don't know what that would look like. I'm just saying it's a theoretical possibility that could have been an alternatives platform, and that person may have been a better choice for self-defense. Though you also, when it comes to self-defense, you can't get into too many theoreticals. You have to look at what is at hand. So I could see that as a counterpoint, is that like, well, okay, there are people who are trying to vote in self-defense, and they didn't have, the whole nature of the system, which is unethical because it denies people better options. They were limited effectively to two options, because even though there were other candidates like Gary Johnson in the race, it was very clear from accurate polling that they were not going to win. Not accurate overall, but accurate in the sense that detecting whether or not the minor party candidates were going to get enough votes to win in any state. So before I wrap this up, I just wanted to propose a method of ethical voting, and and I wanted to also say, when it comes to the minimum viable argument stuff, that I don't think is covered by that name in it, but there's a really good book called The Art of the Argument by Stefan Molyneux, and it does a really good job of, I would describe it as a primer for improving your own arguments and recognizing common flaws in other people's arguments. It's really kind of a starter kit. It gives you some directions where you can go and research more about having, productive arguments with other people, where the purpose is for both of you to achieve, a greater truth from it, to both learn new information and incorporate those into your worldview, and to kind of bring people along and help them see the way you see things. And the second, kind of near the end of it, it has a great section about sophistry. And sophistry is when people, their motives are not to further or embiggen your understanding of the world. Their motives are mostly just to distract you and take up your time and attack you and this kind of thing. So the book goes into it in much greater detail, but I'd highly recommend that. So, one of the things they talk about, I think it's not in that book, it's in Universally Preferable Behavior, which is another book by Stefan Molyneux, and that one is free, available at, I think it's freedomainradio.com/free. There's a segment of books there that are very interesting and compelling reads, in my opinion, if you care about having arguments. And what they do is I think they serve as kind of a reference. So if you are having a discussion with someone, especially, the best people of all are to have discussions of this nature with people who've read those books, then you can discuss whether or not you agree on how something is framed in the book, and then that gets you a lot further along the way, in your discussion, if you can at least agree on how something is defined or described in the book. And sometimes if it's not described in that, you might go to a dictionary or a law dictionary or whatever. The source is not important, but I find that the free books they tend to cover a lot of philosophical topics. So it's often, if you're arguing some of the weightier philosophical issues, it's a good place to start. And even if you disagree entirely with all of the content from it, they're good springboards for starting these discussions about whether or not something is moral or not. So one of the ideas that he talks about in I think UPB is there's a test called the coma test, and it's whether or not a person in a coma can behave. Essentially, he asserts a person in a coma cannot behave unethically. They can't really make any decisions for themselves. They can't be unethical. They can only, you can just be ethical because you're not really messing with anyone or doing anything to be unethical. So if we look at voting from a coma test standpoint, I do think it's important to to attend, which that's a difference a lot of people have with me on voting. They say that if you believe voting is unethical, then you should not be registered to vote and you should not vote in any elections. I disagree, because that doesn't give any track record showing that you attended, that you gave thought to the issues, and that you intentionally did not impose on anyone. So generally the kinds of things that are on my ballot are, whether or not to change the Constitution to include some particular situation or protection for a group or whatever. There are also taxes, whether or not to impose taxes on other people, whether or not, because you don't have to impose taxes on yourself. If you want to pay for a park or something, you just go take money out of your wallet and give it to the park. The only reason you need to vote is to force other people to pay. You never need a tax to force yourself to pay, because if you want to pay, it's not a tax. Another thing is permits, like liquor permits are a big thing around here. Those go to the ballot to decide. And once again, my approach is, because I don't believe in imposing rulers on other people, I go to the ballot box, and I may vote for candidates that absolutely positively can't win, that represent my views more than the winners. So that is something that I sometimes do. So far, none of those candidates have ever won, so I think I'm doing it properly. And that can benefit things like in certain states, certain parties need to have a certain number of votes to remain to retain party status. Party status is important because then they can express their views in a more public forum than if they're not a political party. So by voting for candidates who can't win, you can help alternative voices be present in the general political discussion. So even though I wouldn't want to see that candidate actually win and rule over you, I might want their party to be a part of the discussion during the whole election process, because it can show deficiencies in ethics among the major party candidates and their policies. So I'm going to go and I'm going to vote for, I'm going to undervote usually with candidates, especially if they're uncontested. Anyone who has no opponent, they can vote for themselves and they will win. That's our goofy system. You just get on the ballot, show up, vote for yourself, and you're a judge. Happens all the time. And yeah, a bunch of people oftentimes pile on, but really it's their own vote that was the one that made them a judge. So they voted for themselves and woo, they're a judge. They get to decide whether or not you have search warrants and whether or not who has custody of your kids or whatever. There are all kinds of, things that people who've been elected like that decide. A really good way to tell if someone was elected like that is just go and look at the results and see if the the easiest way is to see if they're uncontested, because it doesn't really matter. As long as they got one vote and they're uncontested, they're that kind of judge or whatever other office. So, go up, undervote. You could, to help with party status or something like that, you might want to vote for someone who can't possibly win, who more closely reflects your views, just to get your views out in the public forum. Taxes, I always vote no against. I vote against all taxes, and the reason is because if I want to pay for something, I can do it, and you all can too. And the only reason we need a tax is to pay for stuff that not everybody wants, not a majority wants, not enough people want, apparently, by their own admission. That's why they're going after a tax, to force people to pay for something that they think is good. So I oppose that all the time, even if it's something that benefits me as a matter of principle. And then the last thing is permits, which I don't really think that I need to, everyone automatically has a permit to do whatever they want in their own business. These permits are, whether or not to serve alcohol in your business. I don't care if they do that. That has no impact on me. I will stay away from their business. The city tries to make a case that people having liquor permits when they're not diligent business owners results in high crime and stuff like that. I say, go and prosecute the crimes. Prosecute the crimes. Prosecute the bar owner for facilitating an environment that is conducive to crime. Don't just revoke permits and that kind of stuff. It's really paternalistic and ridiculous. So yeah, that's what I do. And the interesting thing is, essentially, what I'm doing is I'm voting the way a person in a coma would. So it passes the coma test. If I'm not voting for any candidate to be imposed on you, that's exactly what a non-voting comatose patient would do. If I'm not voting to raise taxes on you, that's what someone in a coma would do if they weren't voting at all. And if I'm voting to allow you to serve liquor at your establishment or whatever, that's what a person in a coma would do by not denying you that right in the first place, or that capability. So yeah, I feel that my voting is moral because it passes the coma test. And if your voting doesn't pass the coma test, then you're imposing on someone, and it would be unethical. So I'd advise you reconsider that. Also, the advantage of my approach is, unlike being in a coma, I do get attendance credit for showing up. My name appears in the voter rolls, and it shows that I attended, and it goes into the vote tallies so that people can see how much support for candidates there is. And there's actually waning support across the board, across the country. voter turnouts are ridiculously low in most elections. People don't care. And this is why I would like to see a thing. Oh, and the parties, they're actually shrinking by huge amounts. So that's why I'd like to see a thing called a quorum law. And that's what I would call it, or something similar. Most people don't know what a quorum is, so it would have to probably have some feel-good sounding name, like a bill to give free kittens to all orphans or something like that. But essentially what the quorum law is it would say that because we supposedly have a democratic system and you have to have 51% of the vote to win, then in any cases where 51% of the, or over 50% of the registered voter base is not does not vote in favor of an imposition such as a tax or denying someone a license or voting for a judge or voting for a candidate or something, in any race where 51% of the voter base, and I would even be willing to, I think it'd be better if we extended that to the adult voting age population of the area. If more than half of people didn't vote for someone like that, then it would just nullify it. It would be as if there were no election for that. There would be no person appointed. It would just be vacant until the next election. And then if people really did think that it's absolutely important that we have a president or a governor or whatever, then they could certainly encourage their friends and neighbors to go out and vote for such a thing. But for the most part, it would keep sociopaths from having an impact on our lives by just, voting for all kinds of stuff that, nobody really wants because people aren't actually showing up and voting. So anyway, that's it for today for me. So I will talk to you tomorrow. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, considering this inspired so much debate in the various chats over the past couple days, I'm sure there are going to be some nitpickers who want to pick at some aspect of it or how I phrase something. But as I said, I wasn't working for days trying to put together the minimum viable argument. These are just things that are significant issues to me in considering voting self-defense or voting ethical. So I think this is a good overview, as most of these are. And also I was also trying to drive a car and not kill anyone at the same time. So I may have inadvertently made a mistake or stuttered or said too many times or something like that. That just kind of goes with the nature of it. But this is when I generally have some time to share my thoughts with people, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, and if you think someone else could benefit from this discussion, please share a link with them. I would love to have them as a virtual guest in my car and tell them what I think about all this stuff, because I have a unique perspective when it comes to voting. I've voted a lot. I've run for office many times, and I've talked to a lot of people about how they vote, like thousands of people. And I have also been a self-defense instructor. So this question was really, the assertion that voting can be self-defense was really kind of a perfect storm of two areas that I feel I know a lot more than the general person about, just due to my training and experience. And I hope that by listening to this, you know a little bit more in those areas too, and will get curious and look into it. That's one of my biggest frustrations about these topics, is that they continually confound people, and they pop their head up in prairie dog and complain about it every so often, but then 6 months to a year later, when they do the same thing, it is clear that they have done absolutely no research in the interim. So hopefully this will encourage people to, read The Art of the Argument, read some of these books, the free books at Free Domain Radio. Start looking into how your voting and electoral system works. Start looking into whether or not what situations in your state, like what the criteria the courts use to determine lawful self-defense. Self-defense isn't just a gun thing, people. Self-defense is anyone attacking you for any reason, and you can use any means. You could stab them in the face with a crochet hook if that's all you got. I mean, that is I think it's important for people to know what they can do, and I think that knowledge ends up protecting innocence in the end of the day, and it also ends up protecting people who, protecting people from being victims of people who don't understand self-defense laws. So I think the people who need to understand it the most are the people who have firearms and knives and cars, because those are often used in self-defense. And that's pretty much everyone when you include cars in it. So anyway, that's it for me today. Got to get to work, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this will become one of your favorites, because I thought it was a really interesting topic, and I can't wait to see what you guys say about it. That's it for me. Have a good one. Bye.